Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Snack and Learn webinar. My name is Simon Delace. I'm a technical director in WSP's Sustainable Water Management and Innovation team. I'm based in London, England, where I've worked for the last couple of years before being in Toronto, Canada, WSP. My counterpart for FloodVue is called Daniel Gortney, who's located in the USA. And we'll have both of our contact details at the end of this presentation. It's absolutely great to be here, and I'm really excited to introduce FloodVue to you all, which is an augmented reality app which really helps bring flood risk to life. The presentation itself will take about 25 minutes, and then we've got about 15 minutes for question and answer. So feel free to put your questions into the box, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. There will be a PDF handout available at the end of this presentation that will provide the slides, and there was a recording being made. So I wanted to start off, as with any presentation, with what the challenge is, what the issue is. So I thought I'd go onto Google and download a list of those key floods that have happened since the start of the year. The really depressing part of that was that actually I only got a few days back from the day that I was putting these slides together, and I pulled off significant floods in South Africa, California, Bolivia, New Zealand, and Brazil. And so I think it's fair to say that actually most of us understand that flooding is a global challenge that's significantly affecting the people across the globe, and that we know that with climate change, this is set to get more intense, and we know that with societal trends, amongst other things, the impact of flooding is likely to get larger as our population density increases, as well as we have other things, other trends such as aging populations as well. But the good news is actually we have a toolbox of well-established methods to assess flood risk. We can use these methods to understand how it's going to flood, where it's going to flood, and the likelihood of it flooding. We can provide flood warnings ahead of time by linking those to our weather forecasts, and that we can use those flood models to assess what the impact of climate change and developments are going to be on flooding, as well as understand what mitigations, how we can design mitigation to relieve that flooding on our communities and infrastructure. So the question is, if we can do all of that, why is there still such a global impact of flooding? And today I want to focus on communicating flood risk, and that is where FloodVue comes into play. Most cities, most countries across the world have flood maps, and these flood maps are designed to show where flooding is going to occur. And in my mind, actually, these maps are produced by specialists for specialists to understand that. So if we take the map in front of you right here on the slide, I've taken that from our Environment Agency in England's website, which shows the extent of flooding across this community. And actually, at the centre of that slide, in the crosshairs, is actually my home, just to illustrate what this map would look like. And as a homeowner, if I was looking at this map, the darker areas show more frequent flooding, and the lighter areas show the extent of less frequent flooding. But I would have quite a few questions about this, such as the area of most frequent flooding seems to follow the road itself, but does that come up onto the curb? Does that come through my front door? And would that potentially get into the electrics of my house? Would I be able to walk around that flooding and still use the pavement? Would I still be able to safely egress this area? Would I be able to escape if there was a major flood? So these can be quite difficult to understand on a local scale, and using my house as an illustration, but of course, This is the same questions we would have whether you were looking at an office building, infrastructure, or many other projects that you might be considering. And when we look at some of the key floods that happened, such as in Germany in 2021, significant devastation from that flooding. And one of the key issues that were highlighted as a result of that was that it wasn't that they didn't have flood maps, because they did. They understood where it was going to flood. They had flood warnings in place, so they were alerting people that it was going to flood. But it was a significant issue because people didn't know that they were at risk of flooding. They didn't know that those warnings were relevant to themselves, and they hadn't prepared ahead of that flood that could have reduced that impact. So communicating flood risk effectively is absolutely essential in reducing the impact of flooding. So I just want to take a pause in this presentation just for a second and have a brief safety moment, and ask you on this presentation, do you know the flood risk in your area? Whether that's at home, your office, your projects, your assets, your sites, or the clients you're working with. If you are at risk, have you signed up to those flood warnings? And do you know what you would do if there was a flood warning that was announced? And I urge you, if you are in an area of flood risk, to seek advice as to what you should do if there was a flood. So this brings me on to FloodVue and how FloodVue can help in the communication of information. So for me, FloodVue helps us to bridge the gap between technical information and non-specialists who need to understand that flood risk information. It doesn't replace those 2D maps. They're still absolutely essential in flood risk management, but it just communicates that exact same information in a far more immersive and understandable way. On the slide in front of you, you can see a screenshot that I've taken from one of the case studies that I'll come on to in a minute. And it shows the augmented reality, so you can see the house as the reality of what you would be seeing, and then the projected flood level that sits around that. And then there's an excerpt in the top left of that shows that exact same floodplain but mitigated with mitigation, so you can see the impact of that mitigation on that floodplain. So before we get into the case studies, which I think are absolutely essential in sort of articulating how FloodVue can benefit, I just wanted to briefly explain how it actually works. So the first point of note is that actually it doesn't need anything different to our existing 2D maps. So all of the information it needs can be gathered from those, from our usual process of producing those maps. It needs 3 key things. It needs the water surface elevation of a flood. It needs the ground surface elevation so that it can work out the depth. And it needs the building footprint so that when you use it in augmented reality, that floodplain goes around the buildings rather than through those buildings. Once it's got that information, it uploads it to the cloud, and then you download that onto your mobile device. And then when you're located within that area, it uses GPS to locate yourself within that model, and then augmented reality to show that flood level. And there's a couple of really, really key things here. The first one is that you can use this anywhere across the globe. It can be used to showcase any kind of flooding, whether that is from surface water, from rivers, from coastal flooding, whether you want to show current flooding, historic flooding, or future flooding, or different types, different frequencies of flooding, or even, as you can see on the screen in front of you, the difference between a current flooding and then as mitigated flooding. It is augmented reality rather than virtual, so it brings these 2 pieces together. And typically, as an output of this, we produce videos for our clients, And typically that would be us producing that as specialists, but there's no reason why we couldn't train others to do that. And we've actually been on this journey with this app for about 2 years so far. And it's really exciting because over that time, we've been able to hone and develop that app. And we've come across three kind of main areas of improvement that we've been able to develop over the last couple of years. First of all, when we first used the app, it was great because you could see this wide expanse of water. But it was quite difficult to understand the context of that because you couldn't see depth. So what we did was we developed a waterfall cascade effect that you can see on the first of the FloodVue augmented reality pictures there. That when you tilt your camera down, it shows you the depth that the water is at that location, and it tells you the depth at any one location as well. The second was the GPS function and locating yourself. And we can probably all relate to having come out of the subway or the underground here in London, that sometimes it takes a few minutes to locate yourself that well, and you might end up walking the wrong way down the street, as I've certainly done before. And so obviously locating yourself exactly within that model is absolutely essential to ensure that what you're seeing is correct. So what we've done is two things. The first is that we can survey a QR code into a location, so you can scan that QR code and it shows you and then pinpoints you within that model. Or as we've done quite a few times, actually we just produce videos for our clients, so we can be sure when we're taking that video, editing that video, that it's showing what it's showing is absolutely accurate. And not only is that essential for quality assurance, but actually we found it's made it far more accessible to the general population, because they can then access that through YouTube rather than having to download the app themselves and then have to use the app. So it feels far more accessible. And the last is the size of the data set, in that at the minute it uploads all of that information to the cloud, downloads that onto your phone. You can do that using your Wi-Fi at your office, or you can use that using out in the field using mobile data. But the key challenge at the minute is that it downloads that whole data set. So it works fantastically well at a community level, but up at regional and national, it would struggle with the size of that data set. So we're currently working to upgrade the app so that it works a bit more like Google, where you'd have the functionality to download that data around your immediate surroundings. So that's how it works in a nutshell. There's obviously a lot of technical stuff that goes into it behind the scenes, but they're the three key main things that you need. And really just to highlight that they are all produced as part of our normal assessments that produce those 2D maps. So I want us to get right in with the case studies, because I think the best way to showcase the app is simply to see the outputs. So I've got one here from Kansas, USA, and we were asked by the client to look at options for assessing the current flood risk and mitigating some of that flood risk, particularly around a local community and one of their storage facilities that had some particularly sensitive equipment in it. So just wanted to show exactly what our current assessments are, the baseline assessments would look like. So on the left-hand side, you can see the existing conditions on that map. The river is flowing through on the black line, and the blue line shows the extent of the 100-year flood. And you can see at the top of that map, the blue lines expand out in almost like an arrowhead into that community. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the mitigated solution. So what they've done is they've created a detention pond upstream of that community, about halfway through that map. You can see the square, And the idea is there that they would lower that land so that when there was a flood, the flood waters would preferentially spill out into that area, the field area, and that by removing that water, you reduce the downstream flooding. But I think it's still quite hard to understand exactly what the impact of that mitigation is. If I was a homeowner looking at the impact, I would still see that there's lots of areas of that highlighted for flooding. And I would still have questions about whether it would be safe for me to access my home, whether there was any measures that I'd need to take. And so with these kind of schemes, they can cost quite a significant amount of money. They can cause quite a lot of disruption with removal of that soil, the noise that it might take. This might be in a park that people would like to use. So it can be quite a hard sell to convince people, if there hasn't been a flood for 5 or 10 years, that there is a risk, and therefore there is the solution that's being promoted is really worthwhile. So what I want to do now is just contrast the map on the left-hand side that you can see, which was that existing the existing method of communicating flood risk, with the FloodVue app that I'll just hit the play button with and talk you through. So you can see as the projection of the floodplain, significant flooding across this community, round that house, significant flooding, and now we'll toggle to that same floodplain but with mitigation. You can see that the flooding is far less significant. It's typically isolated to the gullies and low points on that green area. The road was safe, whereas if we flick back to without mitigation, there's extensive flooding. And actually, when the client went out and showed some of this information to the community, there was a chap who looked at this exact image and knew that whose house that was just opposite us, that grey house. He could see that it was flooded right up to his garage. And he said, "Oh, crikey, I know that is Bob's house, and he's got some really expensive equipment in his garage. And if it floods, that's gonna flood his garage and his equipment." And the client said he'd just never had the level of engagement and feedback that they got through this, through demonstrating the impact in this way. This second slide is from a video. It's from a slightly different location over here, which shows the flooding around the client's building, the municipality building that had sensitive equipment in it. So you can see here the floodplain without mitigation right up to the edge of the building, and then with mitigation, far less extensive flooding. So that's actually the building there in yellow. That was the municipality building. You could see the extensive flooding without mitigation. With mitigation, it was isolated pockets, and that there was safe access to and from that building. And then we're just going to show the waterfall feature just here, so you can see that the depth there is shown, so you can have some kind of perspective as to the area of flooding. So the second case study I want to show is actually from over here in the UK, Eden Park School, where we're commissioned by the client to understand what their current flood risk was, understand what the potential damage of that flooding would cause, and identify some mitigation options to reduce that flood damage. So we produced our computer simulations and our typical 2D maps that you can see here on the screen. You can see in the north there's fairly extensive flooding to the north of the school. So you've got the red line boundary of the school. Then to the north you've got fairly extensive flooding. And you can see that actually a lot of the flood water is getting into the school through a few flow paths in the south, flowing round into the school and across these areas. In the mitigated, there's a few flood relief barriers been adopted to change these flow paths and spill that water around the side into what was the playground as opposed to the school, so reducing that impact. But it's quite hard to tell the impact of some of that work. It's not immediately apparent exactly. There's still pockets of flooding that are there. And if we contrast this with the FloodVue app again, so I've got two locations. One is to the north of the school that actually isn't a major source of the flooding into or the flood damage into the school, so wasn't a focus for the mitigation. And then location two, which benefits from these flood barriers. If we contrast what you can see on that map with what you can see using FloodVue, so you can see that floodwater, extensive floodwater over in this location. Now at the back of the school, location two, you can see the just included there the cascade effect, so you can get an idea of how that works. And you can see these flow paths into the school down that embankment, and where the water ponds up against the edge of that school, showing extensive flooding, and that's where the key damage was being caused by this water through these flow paths, preventing access, safe egress from that school. Now, if we contrast that with the mitigation, so it's the same frequency flooding, the route into the school there over that embankment's been reduced, and the level of flooding up against the school has been significantly reduced. And so we produced this really for several reasons. First of all, was to showcase the work that we've done into the stakeholders for them to understand some of the impact, but also as an education tool for the kids, because actually it was a fantastic opportunity to highlight what the potential impact of flooding is, how that potentially is getting worse with climate change, as well as what the school was doing to keep them safe. And then lastly, just wanted a brief note on a fantastic new project that we're just in the final stages of wrapping up, where there's going to be extensive development of FloodVue to support it, a US government infrastructure owner, around 3 key sites in Oregon, Texas, and Virginia. And the main reason that they wanted to do that was to understand that flooding and how that was affecting their infrastructure, how that was going to change with climate change, so that they could make resilient climate decision making by non-specialists within their body, as well as engage with the local communities and public around those measures that they're adopting to keep that infrastructure from flooding, as well as those communities safe. So we're really excited about where that takes us and the next steps of that project. So that's it. Hopefully that was really, those case studies really helped to understand what the power of FloodVue is. It doesn't replace those 2D maps, which have been produced, in my mind, by specialists for specialists. What it does is it helps bridge that gap between that technical information through to decision makers and people that really need to understand that flood risk. It doesn't use any new information to that which is already required to produce those 2D models. It just takes that same information and presents it in far more immersive and impactful way to communicate the risk and the potential impacts of that flooding. As I say, on that first project in Kansas, the client had never had such significant feedback of people really being able to imagine what that flood and the damage of that would cause. So, and buying into decision making is absolutely key. So we see a couple of potential applications of FloodVue being regulators, with that support for mitigation, as we talked through in Kansas, or just to help articulate what the flood risk is to communities, to infrastructure owners to understand what the flooding is to themselves, the flood risk is to themselves, as well as decision making around mitigation and climate change. Developers in public consultation around new schemes to showcase the lack of impact and the resilience of their schemes to flooding, as well as just so many other potential applications um, for FloodVue. And just talking to someone internally at WSP the other day, they came to us and said, this sounds fantastic. I actually work with emergency response teams and think this would be really great to help as part of their training to understand what they would do during a flood, showcase where safe areas of access and egress are and what the challenges could be. So I think there's just so many different applications that FloodVue could really help to bridge this gap and help communicate far more effectively what the risk is. And I'm just really excited about how that can help us transform the way that we communicate flood risk and help reduce the actual impacts of flooding. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand over now to Sharon, who I believe has got some questions for us.
Thank you, Simon. Fantastic presentation. So just some housekeeping items before we get going. The presentation slides are available to download in the handout box on the control panel, and also you can continue to log your questions in the question box. I will start with the first question. Is it possible to show anything other than depth, such as water velocity or hazard?
So far, we've only shown depth, but there's no reason why we couldn't use that same layer and import it to show velocity or hazard as maybe a heat map across or arrows across that surface. So it's not something we've done so far, but I think there could be real value in exploring that further.
Thank you. Can you clarify if I can use this tool if there is no cell service where I am?
So what you can do is you can download that data at your office, at your home, using the Wi-Fi network, and then go out to the site with that ready to use. And that would be the recommended approach for most of those models anyway.
Thank you. Does FloodVue require a minimum grid size in the flooding model to work properly?
So the way that it presents the data is a function of that grid size. So the finer the grid, the more accurately that it's going to represent the flooding. And clearly, past a certain point, then it starts to be very blocky, and what you're seeing at a local level isn't going to be as accurate as would be on a more detailed model. There isn't an absolute cutoff point. I think some of that would depend on the purpose of what you're trying to showcase, but most of what we're trying to showcase is relatively local impacts of flooding. If you wanted to show, for example, a historic flood across a community, just the extent of that at a much higher level, then I guess a sort of a wider grid would be would still articulate that. But most of what it's used for is quite local, so you'd want a fairly fine grid.
Thank you. How easy is it to import the flood data for an area into the app? Can anyone do it easily?
So the app's been designed with it in mind that it's going to come out of flood models into this app. So it's been designed to do that as easily as possible. And of course, there's different types of data sets that come out of those models, but it's been done to be designed to be as efficient, effective as possible. So I'd say if you're familiar with large data sets and flood outputs, then you shouldn't have too much problems.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming through. The next question is, in what areas of the world can FloodVue be used?
So as I say, the app itself is ambivalent to location. It can be used anywhere across across the world. So as we used 2 case studies here today, one was in the UK and one was over over in Kansas, but there's no reason that couldn't be used in New Zealand, Australia, France, Germany, anywhere.
Thank you. How is uncertainty in modeling results conveyed to the
Mhm.
general public via the app?
So I'd say, it's still as per the usual 2D maps. The level of certainty in the modelling and what you're conveying is absolutely essential to to the general public. So the same methods that you might communicate those would be just as essential. And a key part of what we're showcasing is that by producing videos, you can control that and make sure that the information that's being presented is accurate and that you're happy with it. And to be honest, actually, the app is very good at identifying areas that perhaps models don't make sense, because you can very clearly see if you've got an area of flooding, but actually that doesn't quite tie in with the local topography or the local features. So actually, in some ways, it can identify areas that perhaps the models might have struggled with.
Thank you. Without the flood mitigation model, does FloodVue allow for the display of what flooding would look like with mitigation measures?
So without a
Without that.
mitigation model, um, so I guess you would need to import a layer into FloodVue that represented what that mitigation could look like. So if you hadn't modeled it, you could still represent something as per a mitigation measure, but I guess you'd have to be very careful of it as to exactly how you're producing that, and how that tied into the mitigation measures.
Thank you. We have another question about the grids. Can you clarify if you need two ground surface grids, one for the natural ground and the other with the mitigation infrastructure?
Yeah. So and actually, on the video from the school, I took, you could see just in the background of one of them that there's the water ponds up against nothing, because there isn't a flood barrier there. But you're quite right, you'd have to import that information so that the model could see that.
Thank you. Does this tool apply to tidal flooding?
There's no reason why you couldn't use this for any source of flooding. So far, we've just used it for either river flooding or stormwater or surface water flooding. But there's no reason. It just needs the level of the surface of that flooding, and that could come from anything. So yes, that would be coastal. That could include coastal.
Thank you. How long would it take to implement this on a project from a standing start?
So some of that and forgive me for the ambiguity, but some of that depends on where the information's coming from. So if we are already producing the flood models and have that data ready, that we've already got it all in the right format, then we can do it relatively quickly. All you really need to do is neaten that data up, as I say, process it so you're removing those buildings, and then go out to site to record it, and then you would just be editing that video so that it was in a so that it made sense. So whereas if we were taking on someone else's information, then of course that might take longer to clean that data, and before then it could be used. But we're talking sort of weeks here rather than months.
Thank you. There's a question here. We built 2D model in HEC RAS. I hope I pronounced it correctly, with
Heckraft.
one with 1 meter resolution LiDAR. Is it enough to apply FloodVue app?
So as I say, I think it depends on what you want to showcase here, as to what level of accuracy that you need to import into the model. So at a very coarse resolution, you can show widespread flooding very well, but of course the edges are going to be where things look more coarse. But if you just wanted to showcase the extent of flooding, then any kind of resolution will do that. The lower the resolution, the finer resolution will give you the more detail around specifically around buildings. So, for example, the school, if it was a much coarser resolution, then of course you wouldn't get that same level of detail.
Thank you. Sorry, looks like I have some connectivity issues. Can you still hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, thank you. Is FloodVue available to customers through a subscription? How does pricing work?
Sure. So typically we factor it into the cost of our assessment and our methodology. So we haven't provided to clients as part of a subscription. As I say, typically we would use it on our project and give them the outputs. We haven't, for example, provided it to a client who might want to go out and do that work for them. There's absolutely no reason why we couldn't do that. We would need to train that client on how they would need to use it and get the best outputs from that. And so I think we would need to take a look on exactly how that subscription model would look.
Thank you. We received some really good feedback. So thank you everyone for all your questions today. Please feel free to follow up directly with Simon via the contact details shown on the screen. All additional questions will be answered directly by Simon. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you again, Simon, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen. I hope that was interesting.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everyone.